5-year-old friend named Molly. And Molly is sort of a combination of Eloise and Amelia Bedelia, but much louder. Molly's a lot, and she's a delight. Molly is number 6 in her family, and all of her older siblings do cross country. So when Molly turned 4, she decided she also was going to run cross country. She was going to join the elementary cross country team, and she was going to compete in the elementary school meets. Now, the elementary schoolers, they run a mile, which would take me 6 or 7 hours. And Molly really can school me in this one. But the very first meet she ever ran, her really cool big brother, who was 13, had finished running for the day, and Molly was lining up with all the other kids. And John Paul went over, all 6 foot tall of him, with, like his cool hair thing going on, and like the way that he walks, right? And he lined up behind his 4-year-old sister. Because Molly was the only 4-year-old there, and there were no 5-year-olds there, and she was going to get left in the dust. And John Paul wanted to make sure that when Molly was all alone running that course, she wasn't all alone. And I watched him do this again the next year when Molly was 5 years old, and I thought, well, that's the saints, right? That's the whole point. Is there people who have run this race before, who say, hey, I can come back for you, right? I can run alongside you. And as Molly was running this race, all of her siblings were lined up along the side, and Molly would see them, and she would stop, and she would pick a flower, and she would hold it out to them, and they would, that way, Molly, keep going. And she would turn the wrong direction, and they would turn her around and say, that way, Molly. And I thought, this is the purpose of the saints, right? To fix our eyes back on the destination. The letter to the Hebrews talks about this. This is my favorite scripture passage, Hebrews 12, 1 through 4. It says, therefore, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us rid ourselves of every burden and sin that clings to us and persevere in running the race that lies before us while keeping our eyes fixed on Jesus, the leader and perfecter of faith. For the sake of the joy that lay before him, he endured the cross, despising its shame, and has taken his place at the right of the throne of God. Consider all he endured in opposition from sinners, in order that you might not grow weary and lose heart. In your struggle against sin, you have not yet resisted to the point of shedding blood. I tell you all what, I could do a week-long retreat on that passage. And I loved that passage before I loved the saints. There was something about that passage that called to me, that idea of fixing your eyes on Jesus, that idea of Jesus suffering not only to save us, but also that we would not grow weary and lose heart. But the saints loved me long before I loved them. And they were tugging at me. They were calling to me, and they were saying, hey, look, we're not just a distraction. Because, growing up, everybody I knew who loved the saints, it was sort of to the exclusion of Jesus, right? It was the little old lady who said, well, now, I don't know if I can talk to Jesus, but I can talk to St. Rita. And I was like, ooh, I don't love that, right? And I read 1 Corinthians 11:1, right? St. Paul says, be imitators of me as I am of Christ. And I was like, I get the concept. But the way that people talked about the saints, it just wasn't about Jesus. And the way that Scripture talks about the saints is that these are the ones who surround you to fix your eyes back on Jesus. To say, you know what? Jesus didn't have obsessive compulsive disorder, right? But St. Oscar Romero did. This is what holiness looks like with obsessive compulsive disorder. Jesus didn't endure systemic racism and enslavement. But Blessed Francisco de Paula Victor did. So this is what holiness looks like when that's what you're experiencing. This is what holiness looks like when your parents are divorced. This is what holiness looks like when you're dealing with chronic illness. This is what holiness looks like when you are consumed by shame. Because we have saints who experienced that shame, saints who experienced addiction, saints who went through everything that we've gone through. And the more that I got to know the lives of the saints, the more I realized what a tool they are for evangelization. Because at the heart of the question of evangelization is, can I convince this person that she is loved in spite of everything? Right? Because you'll talk to people and you're like, God loves you. And they're like, yeah, God loves you, right? Put a bumper sticker on your car, that's great. You don't know my life. I'm like, no, I don't. But let me show you what it looks like when the church puts a halo on what you think makes you ineligible for the love of God. There is literally nothing you can do to keep keep God from loving you, and there is no part of your life that God can't use for his glory. And we see this again and again and again in the lives of the saints when we actually tell the stories of the saints instead of just the list of facts, right? See, another reason I struggled with the saints growing up is every story I heard was, she was very holy and she never sinned, and then she became a nun at the end. I was like, good for you, right? Like, I'm glad that worked out for you, but y'all have known me for like 45 seconds, and you can tell that I'm a lot, right? Like, I feel big feelings, and I feel them very loudly at other people, right? And so I would read about all these saints who are described in such saccharine and placid terms. And I thought, there is no hope for me, right? And then I met Teresa of Avila. And I was like, oh, one time there was a salty woman who became a saint. All right. It can happen a second time. Turns out, there's so many different types of personalities and gifts and struggles and sufferings. Everything that you are going through, there's some saint who gets it. And they walk alongside us, and they call to us when we fall down, and they pick us up and drag us sometimes. And they say, look, you are never unloved. Watch what God can do when he works this for glory. So I'm excited to share some stories of saints with you tonight, just the ones that hopefully the Holy Spirit was putting together. None of them are downstairs with the relics. For those for whom relics are creepy and weird, that's totally normal. It's largely an American thing. Modern Americans don't deal with death, right? We don't encounter dead bodies. We don't have a wake where the body is right there in front of us for many hours and we all sing songs and drink whiskey. We don't make the ofrenda. We don't visit the cemeteries. Maybe y'all do, but I've never visited any of my grandparents' tombs. It's just not part of the way that we process things. And so if it's something that you're uncomfortable with, that's okay. The idea of a relic is the same way that if you really loved your grandmother, you might want to go visit her grave. And if 1 million people in 100 countries loved your grandmother, well, wouldn't it be really nice if your grandmother was in 100 countries so all the people could go and visit that grave? And so we chop off the bodies of our saints, and that's weird, and that's okay. If you find that weird, at least you're not in Germany where they put rhinestones on them. Yeah, like the dazzle and everything. So if you find relics weird, good luck. But we can go down and we can visit these saints and just recognize that this is an opportunity, like visiting a grave, where you're drawing close to somebody you love. And you're saying, pray for me. Right? The same thing that we see in the book of Acts, where cloths that were touched to the apostles could work miracles. God could work miracles through these cloths. Sometimes they're miracles, and sometimes it's just, I'm here to see a friend, and that's okay. I want to talk first of all about Venerable Alphonse Gallegos. You have a picture of him on your handout. I like doing slideshows so you can see photographs of these saints. But today we've just got this one picture of Alphonse Gallegos. I'm pretty delighted by this picture because this is a picture that I took of a photograph at somebody's house because this was her friend. And she pulled out a picture of her friend, Bishop Gallegos, in his cowboy hat at the state fair with her family. So it makes me feel like a third-class relic myself. Today is the anniversary of death of Venerable Alphonse Gallegos. Alphonse Gallegos was Mexican-American. He was born in Albuquerque. He grew up in LA, going to public schools in LA City. He had a severe visual impairment to the point that even that as a teenager, before he had some surgeries, if you held up 2 fingers 10 inches in front of his face, he couldn't count them. So he was in special education in public schools in LA City, right? Which I think is just incredible to think about the number of people who haven't seen themselves represented in the saints, right? Hispanic Americans, public school kids, a lot of people who are getting special help in school. He grew up in LA and he discerned a call to the priesthood. And his order that he entered the Augustinians, they were a little bit unsure, right? Because not only did he have this visual impairment that made things really complicated for him, he actually couldn't pray the Liturgy of the Hours in common because his vision wasn't good enough, so he had a dispensation from the office. But he also had a lot of struggles academically because of all of the years that he had spent unable to read functionally. But the church recognized that his gift wasn't impaired by his disability, that he was a gift in who he was. And I'm sure there were people who felt like they were doing this guy a favor by letting him be ordained a priest. But accommodations are not favors, they're justice, right? And he became this enormous gift to the church. The amazing thing about this guy, now he's called the Bishop of the Barrio, right? He would walk the streets, meeting with gang members. I heard a guy tell a story about one time when a dude showed up with a gun, ready to shoot somebody on the street, and Bishop Gallegos talked him down and took the gun and sent the kid home. Right? I mean, this guy goes on to be this incredible gift, and he was a pro-life warrior, and he was friends with all the lowriders, so he would like go out and like walk the streets and like hang out with the guys with the tricked out cars, right? And like pretend he knew stuff about cars and ask them questions and all this. Everybody I talked to who knew this man, they're like, well, he loved me. He loved me. He was a father. He died 31 years ago today. And I talked to a number of people this summer who knew him, and they just kept bursting into tears. Now let me ask you, anybody here, if I asked you about your auxiliary bishop from 30 years ago, you'd start crying because you missed so much? I don't know how Philly works, maybe. This is a special kind of man. See, after he was ordained, he went back to Watts, which is right across the street from Compton in LA, to the parish he grew up in. And he started walking the streets, and he was friends with these kids. When they got arrested, they would call him, not their mom and dad. Now, he didn't speak Spanish growing up, so he had to teach himself Spanish, and he had to overcome some of that shame that some of us may know of not having our ancestral language. And he's doing all these things. He's writing against nuclear proliferation, and he's out there getting kids into school, and eventually he gets made bishop up in Sacramento. And still, as bishop, he's out there walking the streets. He's spending time with prostitutes. He's showing up at people's houses. One woman, she was like, well, you know, I was feeling mad at my parents because like they got my brother this nice car, but they didn't get me a nice car. So I went to the bishop, and I was like, Bishop, I just feel like my parents don't care about me because, you know, I've got this really janky old car. And he was like, no. I'll talk to your dad. I was like, who goes to the bishop to be like, I'm mad at my parents because I don't have a nice car? But he was not a guy in a tower. He was a father, and he loved his children. When you look at pictures of him, he's always got this radiant smile. Because here's the thing, like he had all these issues, right? He was living out in migrant camps for a week at a time, and he was campaigning for better services for Hispanic Catholics, and he was fighting against abortion, and he was fighting against all of these things, all of these issues. It was never about issues. It was only ever about people. And I wonder if you and I are living the kind of life where people know that they're what matters to us. That it's not about our plans, our success, our ideology. It's about the individual in front of me. This man, I mean, he had a lot of power at the end of his life. And his whole life was devoted to people. The last day of his life, he went to visit an AIDS patient who was dying in the hospital. This is 1991, so that's a statement to visit an AIDS patient in 1991. And he went and made tamales with some of the abuelas at one of the churches that he was involved in. And he went with the Korean Catholic community to scout out a location where they were considering building a church. And then he drove up to celebrate confirmations. And after confirmation, an hour outside of Sacramento, the priest was like, you know, Excellency, you should stay here. And he was like, no, I got an early morning, I got work to do. And he went with his driver because he did not drive himself because, you know, the like fingers in front of his face thing, right? He did get a driver's license at one point, but it seems to have been fairly short-lived. He gets in his janky, beat-up old car with a messed-up electric system. And his friend is driving him back, and the car broke down. The car was always breaking down because this man was a bishop, and he wanted to live like a monk. And so he owned basically nothing. The car broke down, and he says, all right, I'll push. And the bishop gets out of his car to push. The driver's like, no, Excellency, I got it. And the bishop's like, look, I'm a big dude, and I can't see. So how about you steer, and I'll push. And he gets out of the car, and he's hit by a car going 60 miles an hour. He was 60 years old. At his funeral, 300 lowrider cars came in procession to celebrate him. Because he was a man who knew that his identity lay in being a father. And I learned about Alphonse Gallegos, and I thought, this is the question. Like, what is the point of my life? Is it success? Is it to accomplish things? Is it to impress people? Is it to make a lot of money? Is it to be the Catholicist? Or is it to love wildly each individual who God puts before me? You guys are the Martin Saints school, which I love because you're sort of leaving room as other people come up, right? You're like, well, we got the three who are already canonized, but servant of God, Leonie Martin, she's going to make it happen. I think we'll get causes for the other ones too. I think you guys are just going to keep getting saint after saint. Servant of God, Leonie Martin is a lovely one. I don't tend to pay too much attention to mainstream saints. And Leonie Martin is beautiful for me because she was a mess. Do you all know her? This is Therese's big sister, and she was just such a disaster. She threw these terrible fits. She got expelled from school multiple times because she would throw these impossible to handle temper tantrums. We think now she may have been on the autism spectrum, or she may have been dealing with a mental illness. There's clearly something going on there. Part of it was that she was abused as a child by one of the staff in the family home. And her parents had no idea. So if you, as a parent, have had this experience of somebody hurting your children and you didn't know it was happening, Zélie and Louis are excellent intercessors for that. Eventually they found out and they separated her from this maid who had been abusing her, and there was reconciliation. But Lainey continued to feel like there was something wrong with her, right? Like everybody else is this perfect little Therese, holy pious little thing. And she really thought she had been switched at birth. And she tried to enter a convent because she really felt like she had a religious vocation, and she lasted 2 months. And she left. And then she tried to enter another convent, and this time she lasted 6 months, and then she left. It was just, she didn't fit. Everywhere she went, she felt like she was a misfit. And her little sisters, Saint Therese, right? Entering the convent at 15 years old, and she would be like, Lainey, I'll pray for you, that you'll have a vocation too. And Lainey's like, thanks. I appreciate the sentiment, but gosh, you make me feel like an absolute failure. She enters a third time the visitation convent, and her father had dementia, but she really felt like this is where I'm supposed to be. And so she leaves her father behind with the one sister who's left to suffer through his last years. And she's not there for his last year of life, and she's not there for his death, and she's not there for his burial, but that's okay if she can just hang under her vocation. And then she left again, which makes the whole thing feel like a waste, right? And if it were me, I'd be like, cool, I'm done. I don't need to be a nun. If this is how hard it is, if this is what it costs me and I get nothing out of it. But Lainey knew who she was in Jesus. She knew that she was loved. However she felt in the eyes of other people, she knew who she was in Jesus. And when Therese died, on her deathbed, she said, I'm going to pray a vocation for Lainey, even if she doesn't have one. And Jesus cannot refuse me. Don't you love Therese? Right? She gets this, the way we talk about her, she's just so sweet and mild. And I'm like, well, I don't know if you and I are the same Therese, right? She's over there I'm going to grab Jesus by the collar. Tell him, my sister is getting a vocation. Finally, Lainey entered, and this time she stayed. And it was still hard, but she was given the grace of perseverance. And she was able, even with her difficulties with emotional regulation, even with her awkwardness and the anxiety that was attendant on that, she was able ultimately to make a place for herself as she was, to conform herself to the rule, but also to help the women in that community understand that it was good that she existed the way that she was, right? That she didn't have to be less herself in order to be Christ. Blessed Nicholas Steno, you've got all of these on here so you can Google them later and find photographs of them. Blessed Nicholas Steno is a favorite of mine. I love when I talk to people and they're like, well, I used to be Catholic, but I believe in the Big Bang Theory. And I'm like, you're welcome for that, because we invented that, right? Just you're welcome. Blessed Nicholas Steno was an absolute scientific genius. is known as the father of geology, the grandfather of paleontology. He invented the science of crystallography. He formed the rules of stratigraphy that are still in place today. He figured out that the heart was a muscle. He figured out where fossils were. He figured out where spit comes from. You have 4 body parts named for this guy. Most of what I know about him, I know from a 6-page biography of him on NASA's website. This is not like when Catholics are like, oh, like some of our saints are athletes, and you're like, yeah, I mean that one guy played rec league soccer for a semester. So cool. And we've got some real athletes, but sometimes we're grasping at straws, right? We're like, look, the patron saint of engineering, and you're like, that guy who one time built a hut? Okay. This guy was not playing games. Right? He's an absolute genius. He was also a Lutheran and was caught up in his experience of science. He goes down to Italy to study there, and he encounters all these Catholics who have this real, deep, living faith that was much more than the caricature that he had heard described. And he begins to wonder, and he begins to read the church fathers. It's dangerous. And one day, he's out in Florence, and he sees a Eucharistic procession. He sees hundreds of Catholics walking along behind the Blessed Sacrament. And he says to himself, either they are all bowing down in heinous and idolatrous worship, or when Jesus said, "This is my body," he meant what he said. And he became Catholic. And he became a priest. And at that point, there were like 9 German-speaking priests in the world. So he became a bishop 2 years later and was sent out up to northern Germany to evangelize, to be a witness. He lived in extreme poverty and died by 48. So if anybody's feeling like you haven't accomplished anything in your life, maybe he's not your guy. Because he did all the things. But one thing I love about Blessed Nicholas Fenno, I am convinced that he had ADHD. We don't know. It's the 17th century. Obviously, there's no diagnosis. But we have one of his prayers. He wanted to focus entirely on anatomy and physiology. And he wrote in his journal, "I pray thee, O God, take this plague from me and free my soul of all distraction, to work on one thing alone and to make myself familiar with the tables of medicine alone." He would get distracted from what he was trying to do and hyper-focus on something else instead. So maybe it wasn't ADHD, but that is really a thing that people with ADHD experience, right? So you can understand in that way. He prayed desperately for God to change the way his brain worked, and God said no, and praise the Lord for that. Because if God had answered that prayer and made him neurotypical, he wouldn't have devised the laws of stratigraphy. He wouldn't have discovered what fossils were. He wouldn't have invented crystallography, right? All of these branches of science that he would never have approached. He wouldn't have become a Catholic. He wouldn't have become a priest. He wouldn't have become a bishop. He wouldn't have become a saint. His neurodiversity was a gift to the church and to the world. It was not an accident. It was not a mistake. Now if you are neurodiverse, you may need medicine, and you may need therapies, and you may need coping mechanisms. That's great, fine, do what works for you. But do not for 1 minute believe that God messed up when he made you. Because God does not make mistakes. In your brain, the way that it works, that's a gift to you, to the church, and to the world. Servant of God Takashi Nagai is another one of these geniuses. He was a Japanese man living in the early 20th century. He was a pioneer in radiology, so much a pioneer that they didn't know about radiation poisoning. So he got leukemia because they weren't wearing lead or anything. He was a convert. He was a college basketball player. So if anybody's into that, it was Japan in the 1920s. So I don't know how good he was, but he was a college basketball player. That's cool. He was a brilliant man. He converted to Catholicism through the love of a good woman and the study of Blaise Pascal, which is a great combination. And he was working as a radiologist. He was a medic in the Japanese army for a while, and he's living in Nagasaki with his wife and his 2 children. 2 of his children were deceased. He sent his 2 children out of town because there had been some bombing going on, and so he and his wife were the only 2 in their family who were in Nagasaki in August of 1945. And his wife was incinerated on impact, but he was in the hospital and he was protected some. He led the movement of recovery. He found survivors, he was dragging people out of the rubble, he was treating their ailments. And in the wake of the bombing, his radiation poisoning obviously got much worse. He was on the point of death. And he prayed. And he had this buddy who he had known in Nagasaki before the war. And he hadn't heard from his buddy in a couple of years. And he was like, you know what, I'm just gonna ask him to pray for me, right? Like, I don't know where he is, I don't know what he's doing, but I know that the Holy Spirit can work in this. Father Colby, will you intercede for me? He had no idea St. Maximilian Kolbe, who was in that window, had been murdered. He had no idea he was dead. But the Spirit told him to ask Father Colby to intercede. And he experienced a sort of healing, not a full restoration to health, but he lived for another 6 years after that. And during that time, he wrote poetry about healing and about forgiveness. He declared that the Christians of Japan, who were killed by far, proportionally in the highest numbers of all the people of Japan in the bombing of Nagasaki, he said that they had been chosen by the Lord as a sacrificial offering for the end of this war. Can you imagine? You buried your wife and nearly everybody you love. To step out of that and say, I trust that God is still good. And we don't have to be people of vengeance. And he said this publicly to the people of Japan, whose entire nation had been functionally destroyed. And he wrote a book about this. They made a movie about it that became the most popular film in Japan that year, 1948. Because he was able to speak with such clarity that even people who didn't know Jesus were touched, were moved by this. I love this image of a man who's a soldier and a basketball player and a scientist and a poet, because you don't have to fit in anybody's boxes, right? You can be incredibly masculine and be a poet. You can be masculine and be a pastry chef. You can be a masculine and be a ballet dancer. You can be feminine and be a kickboxer. You can be feminine and work construction, because your masculinity or femininity, that's integral to who you are. It has nothing to do with what you do, right? God did not mess up when he made you. And if he made you a girl and a construction worker, like, get it, right? And if he made you a Japanese soldier and a poet, beautiful. Because it shows just the incredible breadth of who God is. He ended up dying in 1951, but he was so well loved. Helen Keller came to visit him, right? I mean, internationally known. The Pope sent emissaries to go and see this guy because he was an ordinary guy. He said, I trust that God is working even when everything is ugly. We've got these saints who were geniuses like St. Pulcheria. St. Pulcheria is amazing. She was the empress of the Byzantine Empire in her own right, not because she was married to anybody, because she was amazing. Her brother became emperor when he was 9 years old, and he had regents, of course, and when Pulcheria, she's like 11 years old, and she's like, it's okay, I got it. I guess he was 7, she was 9. She said, I'll take care of his education. So she was in charge of homeschooling the emperor. And then when she turned 15, she was like, actually, you know what? Like, we don't need anybody else in charge. Like, I can be the regent now. So 15-year-old girl just takes over the Byzantine Empire. No big deal. And then when he comes to the age of majority, they rule together. She and her brother together. She's also a consecrated virgin, and so she's got this beautiful prayer life, and she's serving the poor, and she's building hospitals, and all of these things. And eventually, her sketchy sister-in-law was like, jealous of her sister-in-law, the empress, and she's like, I don't want her here anymore. So Pulcheria gets sent away, and she's like, that's all right. I wasn't in this for power. I wasn't in this for fame. I wasn't in this for money. I'm trying to be faithful. And if you don't want me to be empress anymore, like, I'm good. And her brother ruled by himself for like a year and was like, I do not know how to do this. I don't know anything that's going on. I'm really very confused. So Pulcheria comes back not just to rule the empire, but also to be spiritual advisor to the church as a whole. Pope St. Leo the Great convened the Ecumenical Council of Chalcedon and asked Pulcheria to come and speak to the collected bishops of the world to explain to them the hypostatic union, because he recognized that in her holiness and her genius, she had a better handle on it than anybody else. I mean, like, props to Pope St. Leo the Great, too, right? For recognizing the genius of a woman. But Pulcheria appears before the council and speaks before the council. Eventually her brother died, she ruled on her own for a little while, then Attila the Hun was coming, and they were like, oh, we probably need like a general too. And she was like, okay, well, this guy can roll alongside me and we'll like get fake married and it's fine. Like a marriage of state, because she was a consecrated woman. I love her certainty in who she was. It didn't matter what her role was, because her job was to be a woman of prayer. Her job was to be faithful to whatever position God put her in. If that meant empress, fine. And if that meant exiled former empress, like, well, that's more time for prayer. But not all of our saints are geniuses. And I think sometimes, we want to talk about the brilliance of the saints. And we begin to think, well, this is an integral part of holiness. And if you are a genius, your genius is an integral part of your holiness. And if you are not, your simplicity is an integral part of your holiness. Your intellectual disability is an integral part of your holiness. St. Agatha Kim Agi was intellectually disabled. She was a Korean woman who lived in the late 18th, early 19th century. And she was raised pagan. She didn't know Jesus, but she encountered Jesus as a Mary woman. And she was like, this is amazing. So she goes to the Christian community and she said, I love Jesus and Mary. And they were like, awesome, recite the creed. She's like, I only know Jesus and Mary. And they're like, huh. Okay, how about the Our Father? Can you say the Our Father? And she said, I only know Jesus and Mary. And they were like, okay, repeat after me. Hail Mary. And she's like, I only know Jesus and Mary. And they were like, you are too dumb to baptize. Which is not a thing. It's not a thing. Now we are going to cut them some slack. Is anybody here Korean American? The Korean Catholic Church is the coolest of all possible churches. I apologize to literally everybody else. They're the only church to evangelize themselves. Some teenage boys found a book about Catholicism, read it, were like, yup. Started living as Catholics, picked a random day to be Sunday, because they didn't know what day Sunday was. Smuggled one of their guys out of the country to China to get baptized. He got smuggled back in, baptized his buddies. They laid out a map, divided it up, and were like, let's go. In the first 6 months that they were on mission, they baptized 1,000 people. In the first 50 years that they were Catholics in Korea, there was one priest for 6 years total, and he was an undocumented immigrant from China. So, if they were a little bit off on their sacramental theology, I feel like that's fair, right? Given that you taught yourself the entirety of the faith from this one book you found. So, we're gonna cut them some slack. They told her she couldn't be baptized, so they sent her away. But the government didn't care that she wasn't baptized, right? They weren't checking anybody's sacramental records. They arrested her. They knew she was Christian. And they brought her in and began to torture her. And she said, I only know Jesus and Mary. They demanded that she deny the faith. She said, I only know Jesus and Mary. They asked her where the other Christians were hiding. She said, I only know Jesus and Mary. And as they tortured her gruesomely, she just cried out, Jesus, Mary. Finally, they threw her into prison. And the Christians there bowed before her and said, here is Agatha, who only knows Jesus and Mary. And her great shame had become her crowning glory. They baptized her there in the prison, and she died a martyr. And golly, I just love this woman so much. Because it would be so easy for us to look at the broken bits of ourselves, or the bits of ourselves that feel broken even though they're not. The things that people have used to cast shame on us and to say, God can't want me. God can't use me. But imagine a brilliant Agatha. Maybe she would have talked herself into apostasy. Maybe she wouldn't have had the strength to be murdered. But because all she could hold on to was Jesus and Mary, she became a saint. I don't know what in your life makes you feel like God can't want you, but I promise you, it's going to be the best part of your saint story. When we see how God works through that. St. Mark Ji Tian is a great example of this. St. Mark Ji Tian was an opium addict. Not used to be an opium addict. He was an opium addict at the time of his death. See, Mark was born into a Catholic family in China, and he became a doctor, and he was doing some holistic medicine and some Western medicine, and he's serving the poor for free, he's making his mama proud, and he got this stomach ache. And he treated it with laudanum, which is an opiate, which is a totally typical treatment. at the time, as many opioids are totally typical treatments in our country today. And he became addicted. And he kept going to confession. And he kept confessing using opium. And finally his priest, God rest his soul, who did not understand addiction and did not understand confession, said to him, "You're obviously not sorry. Don't come back until you're clean." Which is, first of all, not how addiction works, right? People aren't dealing with addiction because of a lack of willpower. It is a physiological issue. We can maybe be a little bit sympathetic to his lack of understanding of addiction in the 19th century, right? But it's not how confession works. If you go to confession and you're like, "Bless me, Father, for I'm about to sin, it's going to be awesome." Like, no, okay, he's not going to absolve you. But if you go to confession and you're like, "I keep messing up. I keep doing the same thing. I hate that I keep doing the same thing," that is an incredible opportunity for grace. Right? God doesn't wait to pour out grace on us until we're healed. We can't be healed without the grace. We don't earn that grace by perfecting ourselves. The confessional is a place where we come broken. And the Lord looks at us and says, "I still love you." But this priest, for whom I prayed quite a lot, didn't understand that. And he sent him away. And Tian was like, "Well, I don't know what else I can do. If he says I can't receive communion, I can't receive communion, but this is still my church, and you cannot make me leave." And so he showed up every Sunday for 30 years and didn't go to communion. And for 30 years, he prayed that he would die a martyr. If you're maybe in an irregular marriage, if you've had a really traumatizing experience with a priest or in the confessional, if there's some situation that makes you feel, for whatever reason, or that maybe in reality you can't approach the sacraments, this is your guide. Because that does not change God's love for you, and it does not change the fact that this is your home, that you belong in this church, regardless of what you've done or what has been done to you or what anybody said. And this man, he prayed for 30 years that he would die a martyr. And in 1900, during the Boxer Rebellion, they were rounding up Christians. And I'm sure they went to his house, and his neighbors were like, "This guy, like, he can't go 6 hours without a cake. He's not going to stay strong for Jesus." And they came into his home, and they arrested him and his children and his grandchildren. And his grandson said, "Grandpa, where are they taking us?" He said, "They're taking us home." And he asked his captors one favor. He said, "I ask that you kill me last. I don't want anybody in my family to die alone." And he accompanied each one of them to their deaths, and then he went to his death singing the litany of the Blessed Virgin Mary, an opium addict and a canonized saint. Because there is nothing that God cannot work for his glory. And again, I wonder, all those years of praying that he would be released from his addiction, imagine the Lord had said yes. Maybe he wouldn't have had the strength to persevere into martyrdom. Maybe it was those 30 years of clinging to Jesus, though he had nothing else to hold him there. Maybe that's what made sainthood possible for him. But man, I'll tell you what, this guy gives us hope. I want to respect your time, and apparently I got a lot to say about these people today. I want to talk about Laura Montoya. Charles de Foucault, Dulcie Ponchis, they're in Pray For Us. Laura Montoya is not. She's in Saints Around the World. You better grab a copy of that. Laura Montoya was a Colombian woman who nobody wanted. Her dad died when she was little, and her mom didn't want her. She had other daughters who she raised, but not Laura. She sent Laura to live with her grandparents. And her grandparents took care of her for a while, and eventually they thought, we don't really want her either. And they sent her to an orphanage. Now she had a living mother, living grandparents, and living older siblings. And she was being raised in an orphanage. If this is your story, whether you were raised by your family or not, if you have an experience of being unwanted, of feeling unloved, of feeling like a burden to the people who ought to be taking care of you, this is your girl. Because Laura Montoya, in all of those years of feeling like she didn't belong, like nobody wanted her, she knew the love of Jesus. And instead of becoming bitter, instead of allowing herself to define herself by the suffering she endured, she said, this is an invitation to me. I'm never going to let anybody feel this way again. And she encountered the indigenous people of Colombia, and she saw the way that they were unwanted, the way that they were unloved, the way that they were abused and mistreated. And she said, this is what I was made for. This is why God allowed that suffering, so that I would recognize it in them, so that I would refuse to allow them to suffer the way that I have suffered. And she became a mother to the indigenous people. And she was a little bit of a troublemaker, right? She's like, I'm going to go out into the jungles and I'm going to live with the people. And everyone was like, is it because you're a man-hater? And she's like, what? What conversation are we having now? And they're like, girls can't do that because you need to bring priests with you. And she's like, look, if the priests want to come, that's great. Like, we would love to have sacrifices out there, but I don't have priests and I do have none, so we're going to go out and we're going to serve the indigenous people. And they're like, those people are garbage. And she's like, here's the thing. That's not a thing a Christian can say. She went out, she lived as the native people lived. And she ate what they ate and she slept where they slept. She spent the rest of her life pouring her heart out in love because she knew what it was to be unwanted. And she refused to let anybody else have that experience. St. Dulce Pontes is known as the Mother Teresa of Brazil. We tell her story. People are like, she was so sweet and she loved people and she was helpful. And I'm like, okay, cool. And then you hear the part that, like, one time she was a nun and a bus crashed into a tram outside of her building and she ran out of the convent and broke the window of the bus and dragged a dozen people out to safety before it burst into flames. And I'm like, maybe lead with that. I don't know, I just feel like the Marvel superhero approach to Mother Teresa is like a kind of a cool thing. But again, she's such an accessible woman. She loved soccer. She went and watched pro soccer games every weekend when she was a kid. She played the accordion. She would bring her accordion into the slums, into the favelas in Brazil. Because she was like, yeah, you know what, I'm gonna start a labor union for you, and I'm gonna start a school for you, and I'm gonna start a hospital for you, but also, anybody wanna dance? Right? Somebody's gotta wanna dance, right? And she's a troublemaker too. She would find homes for people to live in, which was great, except that they weren't her homes to give away. She had a really good crowbar. She would pry padlocks off of abandoned buildings and be like, you guys can live here now. And then a couple weeks later, the police would come and be like, you don't live here. And you'd be like, Sister Dulce, she'd be like, it's okay. Grab her crowbar, right? She was a woman who said, look, I'm gonna serve the person who's in front of me. I got no big plans. I'm not trying to change the world. I'm just trying to love one person in front of me, and ended up changing the face of the entire nation of Brazil forever. Blessed Luigi and Maria Beltrame Quattrochi were an Italian married couple, 4 kids. That's it, that's the story. They did nothing remarkable. They lived an utterly ordinary life. Now I like the stories of Maria Troncati, the war nurse, jungle surgeon, evangelist, nun, going out into Ecuador and staring down troops of armed soldiers saying, if you love me, call off the war. I mean, I'm all about that. But I also love a saint where you're like, there's not much to say. He smoked, she didn't love it, they argued about that. Their house was pretty loud. All their kids became religious, so that's pretty cool. They dealt with hyperfertility. We have some of her letters where she said, how can I possibly deal with another pregnancy? I am near despair. That's not before she was a saint. Because feelings are not sins. And feelings don't make you a bad Christian, and they don't make you a bad mother, right? Her experience of being a saint involved devastation over a positive pregnancy test. You're allowed to feel your feelings. Yeah, and to see this ordinary couple dealing with ordinary human things and say that's what holiness was for them. Or Blessed Victoire Razoua-Manarivu, who was a Malagasy saint. She was from Madagascar. Her life never went the way she wanted. She wanted to become a nun. Her family said no. She got stuck marrying this jerk of a guy, but she was like, well, at least I'm going to have kids. And then they couldn't have any children. Dealt with infertility for years. And then all of the missionaries were kicked out of the country. And Victoire realized had she become a sister as she wanted, she would have had to leave. But instead, there she is, as Catholic can be, and also the Queen's cousin. So when the church was locked and nobody was allowed in, and there were armed guards stationed at the door, and the Queen's cousin showed up and was like, no, I'm gonna need you to let me in. What was the guard gonna do, right? This is a woman who knew how to use her privilege, who said, look, my life didn't go the way that I wanted to, but God was working. And God worked in all of these circumstances that I wouldn't have chosen in order to make it possible, not only for the church in Madagascar to persevere without missionaries, but to thrive. When the missionaries came back, they were more Catholics than when they left. because Victoire was able to say yes to the circumstances she didn't want in her life. Rutilio Grande and Oscar Romero, I just want you to be friends with because they were on opposite sides of the political spectrum. On opposite sides of the liturgical spectrum, on opposite sides of the theological spectrum, and they were friends. Because you can be friends with people you disagree with. I mean, there may be deal breakers, right? Like, I'm not friends with any Nazis. But I'm friends with a lot of people who believe things that I think are seriously, grievously wrong. But I can see them as human beings. And I can love them, and we can honor the things that we agree on, which makes it possible then for us maybe to come to understand each other. Oscar was able to love Rutilio when he thought Rutilio was sort of a radical there in El Salvador, working for the poor and going out and into the margins and making messes and getting called a communist. And Oscar Romero, as Archbishop, he's like, oh, I don't know about this, man. And then Rutilio got shot. And Oscar Romero went to the grave of his friend, whom he had loved despite their differences. And he said, if this is what they did to him, I have got to make my choice. And he became the saint that he was because he had a buddy who loved him even when they disagreed. They're also a beautiful pair because Oscar Romero, as I said, dealt with obsessive compulsive disorder. Rutilio Grande had anxiety and depression and probably obsessive compulsive disorder as well, so extreme that he was multiple times hospitalized with catatonic schizophrenia. Because mental illness is not a sign of a lack of faith. It doesn't mean that you're not trying hard enough. It doesn't mean that God has abandoned you any more than diabetes or cancer do. He got treatment, he got help. Romero got treatment, he got help. Because God sends us people to help us in the midst of these struggles. It's not something that we have to be ashamed of. For Jan Tyranowski, I'm just going to leave you with a teaser because I want us to have time for questions. Jan Tyranowski, when you Google him, Google's summary is Taylor. He was a chronically ill, working-class bachelor who lived with his mother and died young. And he's the reason that communism fell in the West. And if you want to know a little bit more about Jan Tyranowski, I guess that could be your question, and I'll tell the story. Or you can read about it and pray for us. What questions do you guys have for me? Oh, on here. I didn't put any of my best friends on here. I would say Mark G. Tianshan. Ooh, Charles Bukowski. Okay. The most important story that I tell is Mark G. Tianshan. The second most important is Agatha Kinnicky. The one that I'm closest personal friends with is Charles de Foucault. My favorite of these stories to tell is the one I didn't tell you at the end. There you go.
Tell it.
Okay. So, Jan Tyranowski, working class bachelor, lived with his mom. He's living in Poland in the early 20th century. This is a time when heroes are made, right? He heard a homily from a priest, and the priest said, it is not difficult to be a saint. And he said, bet, right? He's like, I'm gonna do it. I'm gonna start praying. And he starts reading Carmelites, and he's praying 4 hours a day, and he's becoming a saint. He's living in Poland in the 1940s. There are 12 priests in his parish. Can we just take a moment? 12 priests in his parish, 10 of them are sent to concentration camps. And all that's left is 2 old guys. And one of them came to Tyranowski, and he's like, we need you to start a youth group. And Tyranowski was like, I am not going to be good at that. And he was like, yeah, but we really need you. And Tyranowski was like, dude, I'm awkward. And I'm like, intense. I'm like a little bit too much people. I'm just going to push them away. And the priest was like, everybody else is in Dachau. And he was like, right. Okay. So he starts a youth group for like college-age men. He's got this one kid who starts coming to his youth group, like a 20-year-old, who shows up and he's like, I don't know about Mary, right? Like, I mean, he's Polish, so he's gonna love Mary. But he's like, I just feel like Catholics pay too much honor to Mary, and it really detracts from Jesus. And Tyranowski's like, yeah, no, I get that. Why don't you read this book? And he hands him Louis de Montfort's True Devotion to Mary. And the guy takes the book home and he reads it, and he comes back and he's like, yeah. And he takes as his personal motto, Totus Tuus Maria. And it was his motto when he was ordained a priest, and it was his motto when he was consecrated bishop, and it was his motto when he was elected pope. Pope St. John Paul II kept a photograph of his high school youth minister on his desk until the day that he died. Tyranowski died 6 months after JP2 was ordained. He had no idea the seeds his life had planted. At the end of his life, he could have looked back and said, well, Taylor, I'm a working class bachelor, chronically ill, who lives with my mom and I'm dying alone. But because he was faithful in small things, we have the luminous mysteries. We have the theology of the body. We have the end of communism in the West. Now, maybe JP2 becomes a priest all the same. Maybe. But he wouldn't have been that priest. He wouldn't have had that heart for Mary. He wouldn't have been the man that the church needed to shepherd us through the end of the 20th century. And it's because Jan Tyranowski was able to say yes and to be content with this obscure, empty, worthless life, because it was the life that God had given him. You have no idea the seeds your life is planting, or the incredible good that God can do if you choose to be faithful in small things. Right? I mean, right. Isn't he great? He's so great. Other questions?
How and when did you get focused on saints?
I was just saying I need to memorize the year that it was. I want to say maybe 2016. It hasn't been terribly long. And saints are still not my first love. My first love is scripture. But the saints can sort of drag people into the heart of Jesus, and then you can get them reading scripture too. My next book comes out at the end of this month, and it's a book on scripture. I had only ever heard the stories told badly, and then I read Modern Saints by Anne Ball. Has anybody read that? It's fantastic. Modern Saints by Anne Ball. It came out in 1983, so it's limited to the pre-JP2 saints, which means it's almost entirely European saints, because JP2 was one who was like, we're going to go all over, we're going to canonize everybody. But she tells the stories so that they're interesting, and they're about Jesus. And that had never been my experience of saint stories before. So she, unfortunately, is deceased. But I'm going to get to heaven, and I'm going to see all my saint friends and be like, Anne Ball, where's Anne Ball? Because we got to have a conversation, right? Because I owe her quite a lot. I pray for her a lot.
Which saint did you have the most trouble with, and how did you reconnect with that saint?
Ooh, girl. I mean, there are some that I still haven't connected to, and that's okay, right? I always thought, I was just talking to Martha before, and she was like, oh, you're friends with that saint? And I was like, no, I'm not friends with that one. No, that's okay, right? Some of them I'm like, ooh, you're like a little bit off-putting, and sometimes like that's just not your jam, and that's okay. Somebody who I used to be really not friends with, who I am friends with now, that's a tricky one. Yeah, maybe I'm too stubborn to be. No, I mean, I'm sure I've got some people. I think Therese is sort of one, right, where you like hear the saccharine stereotype of Therese, and you're like, yeah, Therese, and then she's like, you know that I dealt with like horrific darkness and suicidal ideations, and like also sometimes just wanted to throw punch people, and you're like, you what? That's a different story from the story that I saw in the movie. Okay, yeah, I think for me, I have to get to a point where I know what the purpose of the story is, and a lot of times when we talk about the saints, it's just a list of facts. And usually, if I can dig in deep enough, I'm like, you know what, actually, I'm gonna say Lorenzo Ruiz. That's gonna be my answer. Because I was trying to write about Lorenzo Ruiz, because, I've got this book that's all focused on geography and showing saints from all over the world, and there are 2 options from the Philippines, because nobody got murdered in the Philippines, because the Philippines is so Catholic, and then you end up having fewer saints. It's sort of a funny little catch-22 to be in. And we know very little about Pedro Colombo, so I couldn't write him, and I'm trying to write Lorenzo Ruiz, I'm trying to figure it out, and I got so frustrated, and I looked at my illustrator, and I was like, what do you even say? Like, his life was out of control, and I was like, oh, that's the story. That because his life was out of control, he became a saint. Everything was perfectly fine and lovely. He had his 3 kids and his Marian processions and his job as a calligrapher, and then he gets accused of murder and he has to run away from a racist government that's going to convict him with no evidence, and he ends up in Japan where it's illegal to be a Christian, and all of a sudden, through no fault of his own, he's being presented with martyrdom. And had his life not spiraled out of control, nobody alive would know his name. But because everything went wrong and it was not his fault, people are going to be naming their babies after him until the end of time. And to consider that in your life, right, when everything is out of control and it's not your fault, and you're like, Jesus, what are you doing? To be like, you know what? I've seen you do this before. I've seen you let everything spiral, and I've seen the way that you bring incredible good out of this. And I'm going to trust that if you could do this with Lorenzo Ruiz, you can do this with my life too. And it might be a while, right? He spent, a year, 2 years in prison being tortured and almost apostatizing again and again. Might be decades before you see meaning from the disaster that your life has become. But God is always working. So, yeah, Lorenzo Ruiz, thank you for that. Maybe one more question, and I'll be available afterwards if people want to chat.
Have you ever visited any of the places where these people either frequented and had some actual exchange with people that actually knew some of these people, or where they were born?
So the only real interviews I've done were with Alphonse Gallegos' friends in California this summer, but I do visit on pilgrimage quite a lot. I've been to every U.S. American saint and blessed, and most of the venerables, and a handful of servants of God as well. It helps when you live out of car. You've got a lot of options of places to go. My favorite story of pilgrimage, though, is St. Leopold Mandich. So he died in, I want to say 1942. So there isn't anybody alive who knew him who I encountered. But I went to visit his shrine just because I was in Padua, and I was like, there's got to be more than just Anthony, right? Turns out, if you're ever in Padua, right, St. Luke, the Apostle, St. Matthias, the Apostle, St. Anthony of Padua, and then Leopold Mandich and Eustochium of Padua, who are awesome but lesser known. And so I'm telling my friend, I'm like, oh, we should go to Mass at St. Leopold Mandich's shrine. And she's like, great, tell me about him. And I was like, he was short. She was like, that's probably not why they canonized him. I was like, it's literally everything that I know about him. He was short. I mean, he was 4'5", he was short, right? So we go to visit his shrine, and I'm kind of like, oh, I collect saints, it's whatever, I'll go see this random short dude. And I started to read his story, and I was like, oh, this guy has been trying to be my friend for a long time. See, Leopold Mandich was a Croatian man born in the late 19th century, and he, as a teenager, was certain that God had called him to end the Great Schism. Just to reunite the Orthodox and Catholic churches. No big deal. It's been 900 years we've been separated, but he's like, I'm on it. I'm going to end the schism. And so he became a Capuchin Franciscan and got sent to Italy, where there are not really Orthodox. But he wanted to be faithful, so he was obedient. And he went to Italy and basically spent 40 years in the confessional. 12 hours a day, praying for 3-4 hours every night. And he kept going back to his superiors and saying, I know that God has called me to work to end the Great Schism. I know that he's called me for outreach to the Orthodox. And every time they would say, okay, go back to the confessional. 4 months before he died, he wrote in his journal, now I am certain that God is going to use me to end the Great Schism. And then he died. He died never having attained the deepest longing of his heart, and he died a happy man because he died faithful. He was loved, and ultimately what he wanted was not to be successful in this mission he was convicted of. Ultimately what he wanted was Jesus. And he knew that he belonged to Jesus. And I tell you what, I read about saints who prayed and prayed and prayed and prayed and finally got what they want. And I'm like, that's great for you. I love that that happened to you. It's actually not helpful to me. Because when I see these saints who had their prayers miraculously answered, it's so easy for me to fix my heart on answered prayers. instead of on the one who answers prayers. Leopold Mandich, he comes and sits next to me, all 4'5" of him, and leans his head on my shoulder and says, "This is not okay. And God is so good." To have a saint friend who can sit with you in your decades-long unanswered prayers and say, "You don't have to like this, and you can still love God." We can acknowledge that a situation is unfair and that it's not what you want, and you can still be faithful to the God who you love in the midst of that. And to have a saint friend who sits with me in that, who walks with me in that, is one of really the great gifts of my life. And it is purely because I was like, I don't know, there's probably other saints in Panama. So I'm a big fan of pilgrimage, even to saints that you don't yet care about, because they may care about you, and they may be trying to figure out a way to get into your heart. So thank you guys so much. I will be available signing books and chatting, especially if you have a situation that you need a saint for. If there's a particular struggle or a particular relationship, whether for yourself or a friend or actually a friend, you are welcome to come grab me afterwards, and I am super happy to matchmake you with a saint friend. And I think that we have